Tonight, a Nunavut RCMP officer is under investigation after video emerges of a man being hit by an officer in a moving vehicle. Are we any closer to reconciliation 5 years after the calls to action were released?
We just decided that, this is our best bet was just err on the side of caution and not have it.
And Powwow delayed. The Manitoba First Nation reverses course. Good evening, I'm Brittany Hobson. We begin tonight in Nunavut, where a video showing RCMP arresting a man is going viral and has residents wondering who exactly is policing the police. Our Kent Driscoll has a story, and we warn you, this video may be disturbing to some.
This is Kinngait, known as Cape Dorset in English, located about 30 minutes by air west of Iqaluit. Known for world-class artwork, this community of 1,400 is one of Nunavut's best-known small communities. Back in February, RCMP here shot and killed a man. Last night in Kinngait, this happened. Look closely. RCMP opened the door of a moving truck to ram the seemingly intoxicated man. There are 5 police responding. Typically, there are only 6 RCMP stationed in Cape Dorset. Residents began to respond.
News!
We asked Nunavut RCMP to come on APTN National News to explain this video. They refused, instead offering a written statement. It reads in part, "While these investigations are being conducted, the officer will be removed from the community and placed on administrative duties. The RCMP takes the conduct of our officer seriously and wants to assure the public we have confidence in the process of the external investigation to determine the circumstances of the event and whether criminal charges should be sworn against the officer." There have been 5 investigations into police actions in Nunavut launched since January, 3 of them involving RCMP shooting residents. 2 of the shootings were fatal. There's a growing call for Nunavut RCMP to wear body cameras. Until that happens, residents will have to record themselves. Kent Driscoll, APTN National News, Iqaluit.
Meanwhile, across the border, protests against police violence in the United States are entering their 2nd week. In his daily address on Tuesday, the Prime Minister was asked about the ongoing protests and what he thought about President Donald Trump's harsh response to the unrest. Before answering, the Prime Minister paused for 21 seconds. Take a listen.
You've been reluctant to comment on the words and actions of the U.S. President, but we do have Donald Trump now calling for military action against protesters. We saw protesters tear gas yesterday to make way for a presidential photo op. I'd like to ask you what you think about that, and if you don't want to comment, what message do you think you're sending?
We all watch in horror and consternation what's going on in the United States. It is a time to pull people together, but it is a time to listen. It is a time to learn what injustices continue despite progress over years and decades. But it is a time for us as Canadians to recognize that we too have our challenges.
NDP leader Jagmeet Singh is calling on the Prime Minister to do more to fight racism in Canada. Singh says Trudeau needs to take real action.
People are angry. They're feeling like enough is enough. Why do they need to keep on asking? Why do Black people, why do Indigenous people need to keep on asking to be treated like a human? Why? You know what? People are done with pretty speeches. Particularly pretty speeches from people in power that could do something about it right now if they wanted to.
Singh is also calling on the Prime Minister to stop the over-policing and over-incarceration of Black people. Tasha Mack has been sentenced to 8.5 years in prison for her role in the death of 19-month-old Anthony Rain. The toddler's body was found outside an Edmonton church in 2017. Mack was convicted of manslaughter and will spend the next 5 years in prison with time served. Her boyfriend, Joey Cryer, was Anthony Rain's father. He was also convicted of manslaughter. He will be sentenced later this month. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada released its final report and calls to action 5 years ago. More on that after the break. Here is Wednesday's weather forecast beginning on the East Coast. 12 above in Halifax, 15 in Fredericton, 2 in Nain, 12 above in La Grande River, 19 in Quebec City, 17 in Montreal, 26 and cloudy in Toronto and London, 28 in Sarnia, 18 in rain in Wawa, 29 above in Thunder Bay, in northern Manitoba, 17 in Norway House and God's Lake, 29 and rain in Winnipeg, 28 in Brandon, in Saskatchewan, sun and 24 in Swift Current, 26 in Yorkton, 16 above in La Ronge, 15 in rain in Buffalo Narrows. Welcome back. 5 years ago on this day, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its 94 calls to action. For more on the 5th anniversary of the release, we're joined by Rai Moran, the director of the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. Rai, thanks for joining us today. I want to start and talk about how you are reflecting on the anniversary of the release of the 94 calls to action.
Well, for me personally, it's definitely a moment for pause and reflection. Time does fly, and 5 years seems at once but a blink of an eye, and also a very long road that we've covered since the release of the TRC's calls to action.
Earlier this year, as actions were taking place from coast to coast in support of the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, people were declaring reconciliation is dead. Do you believe this is the case?
Well, I think for some people it certainly did suffer a major blow or a major setback, and I think we always have to recognize that there's many voices involved in this conversation of reconciliation, and many people have many different understandings in terms of what it means to them. So I think there was a very significant impact that those protests had on Canada. That said, I think that reconciliation is still very much alive and well in this country, because there's an incredible amount of activity happening from coast to coast to coast in the area of cultural resurgence, revitalization, language revitalization, reclamation, people learning their songs, their dances, their traditions. All of that is very, very much part of reconciliation, and that thankfully is alive and well and growing with ever increasing force across the country.
Do you think has enough progress been made on the calls to action in the past 5 years?
Yeah, this is one of the questions that we get asked so frequently, and I think it's very unequal. On some of the calls to action, I think we're seeing quite a bit of progress. I think in the areas of education, we're doing pretty well. I think people like Cindy Blackstock, would say that the current state of child welfare in this country remains abysmal, and there's a huge amount of work that has to happen. There's major calls to action that have not been implemented either. The fact that you're even asking me this question is a symbol that the National Council for Reconciliation has not been established. And this is a critically important call to action that is intended to monitor, to track progress of implementation, to establish multi-year plans for reconciliation. You know, there's money set aside, there's been a report that's been released, but we're not seeing a lot of substantive progress on that call to action. And that has been widely regarded by many in this work as being one of the most important, if not the most important, of the calls to action.
There's currently a legal battle going on over the fate of residential school historical records. What can you tell us about that?
Well, this is where we get into the current status of the state is such that, you know, the truth part of truth and reconciliation is oftentimes the most difficult area of the work that we do. The NCTR has been fighting very hard for a very long period of time, picking up the battles that were started by the TRC to protect and preserve residential schools' history. We've carried that torch forward. It has not always been easy. We remain in court. We've recently appealed a decision related to what we feel is very, very important information related to the harms inflicted upon communities and individuals in the residential schools. That information right now is not slated to be preserved. It's slated to be destroyed along with other residential school records. Those that are advising us at the NCTR, our elders, our survivors circle, governing circle members, are really concerned that when we, destroy some of this information, we lose a great deal of insight into the harm that has been intentionally inflicted upon communities and individuals. And it's that harm that we have to remember, because we know that there's already been lots of efforts to deny that the residential schools even occurred or that they were as bad as people say they were. And that's only going to continue over time. So preserving the historical record is fundamental. It was always a core part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's mandate, and we continue to fight that fight every single day.
Well, thanks again, Ryan. I want to thank you again for joining us here as we take a look back on the 5th anniversary.
Thanks for having me on.
For more on the 5th anniversary of the release of the TRC's calls to action, Jamie Pashagumskum spoke to survivors and leaders of the progress made so far and has this report.
Garnet Anjikanib is a survivor of the Pelican Lake Indian Residential School. He says when the calls for justice came out in 2015, people were hopeful. Half a decade later, he's not quite as optimistic.
I feel more empowered. Am I healed? Am I in control of my own life now? And I'm not necessarily sure, given that we're still battling with the government in the courts. And that's an example of how we have not moved forward in the last 5 years and even longer.
As of December, only 9 out of the 94 calls to action are completed. That is according to a report by the Yellowhead Institute. The TRC calls to action has 6 sections. Out of 94 calls to action, none have been completed in the area of child welfare, 0 in the area of education, and 1 in the area of language and culture. That was the federal acknowledgement of Indigenous language rights. 0 have been completed in the area of health. 1 was completed in the area of justice, which was the missing and murdered Indigenous women's and girls' national inquiry, while 7 were completed from the section marked reconciliation. These were mainly acts by church groups and programs for sports and arts. A statement today from Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett's office says the federal government has been making progress in many important areas. We are implementing Jordan's Principle, which makes sure all First Nations children in Canada can access the products, services, and supports they need when they need them. President Clement Chartier of the Métis National Council says Métis were greatly overlooked during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's process.
And in fact, as president of the Métis National Council, I wasn't even invited to the release of the final report. 5 years ago, I sat in my apartment watching it live from 2 blocks away. So anyway, and we're not included in the TRC mandate and basically totally marginalized in that process.
Chartier says the lone exception is the Île-à-la-Crosse Residential School in northern Saskatchewan, and negotiations for compensation for those survivors are underway. Rai Moran of the Centre for Truth and Reconciliation says while some progress has been made, a major missing piece is more hard data and statistics on Indigenous people, which is now a bigger problem because of COVID-19.
That problem that we're seeing with this current pandemic is manifest across many different sectors. So we don't really have a firm grasp on a number of kids in care. We don't really have a firm grasp on maternal health outcomes. There's a whole bunch of key primary indicators that the TRC said we have to be monitoring and we have to be keeping track of.
Moran stressed that pushing for that data would be the mandate of the National Council on Reconciliation, and that the next call to action he would like to see is the formation of that council. Jamie Pashagumskum, APTN National News, Ottawa.
APTN partnered with Canadian Roots Exchange to discuss the TRC with youth and get their take on the report and recommendations 5 years later. Here's a portion of the discussion during a live online event from earlier today.
So I think we really need to reevaluate how much is being done in regards to these calls to action, and specifically, are we amplifying the voices of Indigenous young people? And I think that's one thing that we really need to look at moving forward is how can we center the voices of Indigenous young people in this country, because they are the fastest growing, we are the fastest growing demographic in Canada. And, in years from now, we will be the dominant demographic. And so how can we bring those important, powerful Indigenous youth voices to the forefront, leading these conversations around reconciliation?
I know Canada would like to disagree with all of them and say none of it should happen because they want to reduce their debt load, they want to reduce their finances, to really get rid of this Indian problem. I don't think that's really changed in our history. But I don't think that the calls will be forgotten so long as there's intergenerational trauma and there's survivors that are living through with that. I think that as long as these important investments and these important structural changes haven't been made, then the spirit of the calls to action will continue to live on and will actually grow and grow and grow until there's such a movement in Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities that change is required by governments of the day.
I want the survivors of residential school to know that we are working hard to make sure that their visions and their voices are respected. I want them to know that our work is to make sure that this never happens again. I want them to know that things are going to be okay. That in my work, I see so many Indigenous young people who are brimming with pride for who they are, growing their hair long and wearing these beautiful beadwork and medallions, other cultural things, people who are coming back to ceremony, coming back to identity, coming back to who we are as Nihiwa, as Anishinaabe people, as Métis people, and that their suffering and their storytelling of what happened wasn't for nothing, and that we're going to be okay.
You can catch that entire conversation at APTN News/topic/TRC. And we'd like to hear how you're reflecting on the 5th anniversary of the release of the TRC's calls to action. Here's how to continue the conversation. Send your emails to news@aptn.ca. Find us online at aptnnews.ca and on youtube.com/APTN News. Also, you can follow APTN News on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for more Indigenous news. An Inuit women's group says it's not enough. Last week, the federal government announced 12 new women's shelters will be built, 10 on reserve and 2 up north. But as Todd Lamarand reports, that group has a counter-proposal.
2 years ago, Rebecca Kudlu testified before the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls National Inquiry. And she's disappointed with the plan announced by Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller last Friday.
Like, we have the highest rates of violence in Canada up north. And for us to be getting 2, we don't know where, it's not good enough.
Kudlu wants 4 multi-purpose shelters for Inuit in the north and 1 in Ottawa for an immediate investment of $20 million.
Because they go down with no money a lot of times, and people take advantage of that. They can either, be trafficked or go into prostitution. Sometimes they have no other choice or go on the streets. They're homeless.
On Monday, Prime Minister Trudeau cited the pandemic as the reason for the delay in releasing the government's response to the MMIWG report. Kudlu is frustrated, especially for the pain families went through.
Women are still getting killed to this day, so we're going to have to do something. And we've been asking that for 35 years, so how much longer are we going to be fighting for this?
Kudlu wants to hear a national MMIWG action plan by December at the latest.
That this inquiry and all the pain and opening wounds was worth something.
APTN asked Indigenous Services where the 2 northern shelters are going. The department responded that Indigenous organizations must express an interest and submit a proposal. Todd Lamarand, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Time for another quick break. Coming up, one lucky woman in Yellowknife hit the lotto jackpot. Here's the rest of Wednesday's weather forecast, picking back up in northern Alberta. 16 in Grand Prairie, Peace River, and High Level. 17 in sun in Red Deer and Calgary. On the west coast, 21 in Penticton, sun and cloud, and 14 in Tofino. 14 in Smithers, 21 in Fort Nelson. In the Yukon, 15 above in Whitehorse, 18 in Mayo. Over to the NWT, 12 in Yellowknife and 16 in Wrigley. 8 in Colville Lake, sunny skies, and 17 in Fort McPherson. In Nunavut, 0 in Baker Lake, -1 in Whale Cove. 1 above in Clyde River, 6 in Iqaluit. Welcome back. Thanks for sticking with us. And now for an update to a story we brought you yesterday. Lake Manitoba First Nation has decided to postpone its powwow, which was set to take place the weekend of June 19th. Community leadership announced last week it was going ahead with the celebrations despite being on lockdown during the pandemic. They said they were confident in Manitoba's low numbers of the virus and were going to follow physical distancing restrictions. However, after hearing from some community members, Lake Manitoba has delayed the powwow. They plan on hosting it for 3 days beginning July 24th. Chief Cornell McLean said some of the community's elders expressed concerns.
It was a hot topic in the community, right? A lot were for it, and then, a lot were, well, not a lot, maybe a handful were against it, and, but just wanted to respect everybody's wishes, and we just decided that, this is our best bet was just err on the side of caution and not have it.
Last month, we aired a story about a group of women in Saskatchewan who call themselves the Mask Makers. They provide free masks to those in need, especially to the far north of the province. Angela Bishop, the coordinator of the group, says so far the group has provided over 5,000 masks. The group does not sell any masks and are no longer accepting fabric donations because they have enough for now. The Métis Nation of Saskatchewan took notice of all the hard work the group does and gifted the mask makers with 15 new sewing machines. Bishop said the group of sewers was overwhelmed by the donation.
I think that with these sewing machines and other things, that this has been quite the gift, because these are the best tools for the job.
A Yellowknife resident is $55 million richer this week thanks to an $11 Lotto Max ticket. Laura Tucho has claimed the Northwest Territories' biggest lottery prize to date. In a press release from the Lottery Corporation, Tucho said she was in shock, but her priority will be to use the money to help her immediate family. Originally from Delaney, Tucho has dedicated her career to the revitalization of the Satu'ghatene language. And that's your APTN National News for this Tuesday. For the latest, visit our website, aptnnews.ca. Join us back here tomorrow as we look at the one-year anniversary of the release of the National Inquiry's report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I'm Brittany Hobson. Have a good night.